On the morning of November 11, 1918, Karl I of Austria signed a document in the Yellow Salon of the Schönbrunn Palace that did not use the word abdication. He had been advised not to. His lawyers and ministers told him that if he abdicated, he would be surrendering a claim the House of Habsburg had held for 6 centuries. So instead he renounced participation in affairs of state. He left the question of what he actually was open, on paper, in the hope that paper might someday matter again. By evening, he and his wife, Empress Zita, and their 7 children had left Schönbrunn for the last time. The palace staff lined the corridors. Some of them wept. The youngest child, Elizabeth, was 3 months old. Karl was 29 years old. He had been emperor for less than 2 years. He had inherited the throne in November 1916, when his great-uncle Franz Joseph died after 68 years of rule, and he had inherited it in the middle of a war that was already lost. He had tried to end it through secret negotiations with the French, negotiations that his German allies discovered and used to humiliate him publicly. He had promised constitutional reforms he could not deliver. He had watched the empire that had governed Central Europe since the 15th century dissolve not in battle but in committee rooms, in the offices of nationality councils, in the proclamations of successor states that simply declared themselves into existence and waited for Vienna to catch up. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What followed that November morning was not a clean break. It was something messier and stranger, a dynasty that refused for decades to understand that it was finished, and a republic that could not quite decide what to do with the family it had displaced. The story of the Habsburgs after 1918 is not a story of quiet exile. It is a story of attempted returns, of legal battles that ran for generations, of a law passed specifically to prevent one man from entering his own country, of children born in exile who grew old in exile and died having never seen the capital their family had built. And it is a story that is not finished, because the House of Habsburg Lorraine still exists, still holds reunions, still issues statements, and still produces heirs, in a Europe that the original empire would not recognize. To understand what the fall cost, you have to understand what was being held together. The Austro-Hungarian Empire at its peak governed 50 million people across 11 major nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Slovenes, Slovaks, Serbs, Romanians, Italians, and Ukrainians, in a territory that covered the modern states of Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and portions of Poland, Romania, and Italy. It was administered in 2 halves, the Austrian half and the Hungarian half, each with its own parliament and government, held together at the seam by the emperor, who was simultaneously Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. The army, the foreign ministry, and the imperial finances were shared. Everything else was negotiated, constantly, between nationalities that had been rivals for centuries and between the 2 dominant halves that barely trusted each other. Franz Joseph had managed this through sheer duration. He had been on the throne long enough that the empire's contradictions had become familiar, almost comfortable. His death in 1916 removed the one figure whose personal authority had been the operating system of the whole arrangement. Karl inherited a machine whose parts had been grinding against each other for decades, and whose wartime stress had finally begun to shear them apart. By the autumn of 1918, the Czech National Council had declared a republic in Prague. The South Slavs had announced the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. Hungary had effectively detached. The empire did not fall. It evaporated, nationality by nationality, council by council, until what remained was a German-speaking rump in Vienna that called itself the Republic of German Austria and asked, briefly, to be annexed to Germany, a request that the victorious Allied powers declined. Karl and Zita and their children went first to the family estate at Eckartsau in Lower Austria, a hunting lodge that had been imperial property, and they stayed there through the winter of 1918 and 1919. The conditions were not comfortable. Heating was inadequate, food was irregular. The new republic had stripped the family of their assets, passed the Habsburg Law in April 1919, which expelled all members of the dynasty from Austrian territory, and confiscated the property of those who would not renounce their claims and pledge loyalty to the republic. Karl would not renounce. He left Austria in March 1919, escorted to the Swiss border by a British military mission that had come partly out of courtesy and partly because the Allied powers had a vested interest in ensuring that the deposed emperor did not become a rallying point for monarchist disorder. He was 31 years old. He had 8 children. Zita was pregnant with the 8th when they crossed the border. What happened next was something that almost no deposed monarch has ever attempted. Karl went back, twice. In March 1921, he arrived unannounced in Hungary, which was then governed by the regent, Miklos Horthy, a former Habsburg admiral, who had been appointed to hold the throne in trust for a king who had not yet been determined. Karl had calculated that Horthy would stand aside. He was wrong. Horthy told him that the return of a Habsburg to the Hungarian throne would mean immediate Allied intervention and the invasion of Hungary by its neighboring successor states, who had signed a little entente specifically to prevent Habsburg restoration. Karl argued. Zita argued. Horthy held firm. Karl returned to Switzerland, where the family was living in the Château de Pringens on the shore of Lake Geneva. He went back again in October of the same year, this time with an aircraft, a small military escort, and further into Hungarian territory before Horthy's forces intercepted him near the town of Budaörs. There was a skirmish, casualties on both sides, and Karl surrendered. He and Zita were taken by river gunboat down the Danube to the port of Bahia, transferred to a British vessel, and deported to Madeira, the Portuguese island in the Atlantic, where the Allied powers had decided they would cause the least disruption. Madeira in 1921 was not a punishment post in any formal sense. The climate was mild, the island had hotels and estates and a small expatriate community, but Karl arrived already ill, weakened by the strain of the 2 return attempts and by the travel, and the accommodation the Portuguese government provided was not adequate for a family of 10. They lived in the Quinta do Monte, a villa above Funchal, and Karl's health deteriorated through the winter. He developed pneumonia in the early months of 1922. He was 34 years old. He died on April 1, 1922, with Zita beside him, the older children present, the younger ones in the next room. His last recorded words, addressed to his son Otto, were a request that the boy not forget what he owed to Austria. He had been emperor for 2 years, deposed for 3, and dead at the age that most men are still working out who they are. Zita was 29 years old. She had 8 children, the oldest of whom was 9. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What Zita did in the decades that followed is one of the stranger stories of 20th century Europe. She did not remarry. She did not fade. She became, in effect, the living archive of the dynasty, the keeper of its claims and its memory and its moral weight, and she remained that for 67 years after Karl's death. She buried him in the church of Nossa Senhora do Monte above Funchal, and refused to have the body moved for decades, a decision that was part mourning and part political statement, since a Habsburg buried in Madeira was a Habsburg whose return had not yet been accepted by anyone who mattered. She raised 8 children in exile, moving between Spain, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Americas, settling in Quebec during the Second World War, when the European monarchies were falling and it was unclear which of them would survive. She and the children lived in a house in Tuxedo Park, New York, and later near Montreal, supported partly by the charity of Catholic communities and the residual loyalty of Austro-Hungarian emigrant networks, and partly by Zita's own considerable capacity to maintain the forms of a court with almost none of its substance. The eldest son, Otto, became the head of the house when Karl died, and held that position for 89 years. This requires a moment to consider. Otto von Habsburg was born in 1912 and died in 2011. He was 9 years old when his father died in Madeira and 98 years old when he died in Pucking in Bavaria, and in those 89 years he produced a body of political work that most professional politicians would find extraordinary. He became a theorist of European federalism before the European Union existed. He wrote books on international politics. He became a member of the European Parliament for the Christian Social Union of Bavaria, representing a German constituency for his adopted country, serving from 1979 until 1999. He was not a monarch in exile quietly nursing grievances. He was a working politician who happened to also be the heir to a defunct throne, and he treated those 2 identities as entirely compatible. The reason he was in Bavaria rather than Austria requires a return to the 1919 Habsburg Law. That law had established that any member of the dynasty who wished to return to Austria had to formally renounce all dynastic claims and pledge unconditional loyalty to the Republic. Franz Joseph's daughter Marie Valerie had stayed in Austria and accepted these terms. Others had signed and been permitted to return. Otto had not signed. He had not signed for decades, partly because signing would have required him to renounce on behalf of his descendants as well, and partly because the monarchist movement in Austria, which remained a real political force through the 1930s, hoped for a restoration that never came. In 1938, when Germany annexed Austria, Otto was on a list of people to be arrested. He spent the war working, with some effectiveness, to preserve the idea of an independent Austria that was distinct from Germany, lobbying in Washington, corresponding with Roosevelt, arguing that Austria was an occupied nation rather than a willing participant in the Reich. This position was eventually adopted by the Allies in the Moscow Declaration of 1943 and became the founding myth of post-war Austrian sovereignty, though historians have argued extensively about how much of that myth was accurate. It was not until 1961 that Otto formally renounced his dynastic claims under the terms the Austrian Republic required. The Austrian government then debated for a year whether the renunciation was genuine. A court ruled it was. Otto entered Austria for the first time in 42 years in 1966 and was met at the airport by a crowd of monarchist supporters who had waited a very long time to see him. He subsequently became an Austrian citizen, but he continued to live primarily in Bavaria, represent a German constituency in the European Parliament, and treat Austria with the particular mixture of attachment and exasperation that characterizes a relationship between a man and a country that once threw him out. The fate of Karl's remains took a different path than the fate of his son. In 1936, Zita finally agreed to have Karl's heart, removed at his death in the tradition of Habsburg burial practice, returned to Austria and interred in the Herzgruft, the heart crypt beneath the Augustinian church in Vienna, where Habsburg hearts had been kept since the 17th century. His body remained in Madeira. In 2004, Pope John Paul II beatified Karl, declaring him blessed in the Catholic Church, a decision that the Austrian Republic received with diplomatic discomfort, since beatifying a former emperor implicitly endorsed a version of Habsburg history that the Republic had spent 85 years competing with. Zita herself outlived Karl by 67 years. She died in 1989 at the age of 96, having watched the Second World War, the Cold War, and the beginning of its end. She had spent most of her widowhood in the convent of Zangberg in Bavaria, where she lived in a small suite of rooms, received visitors, maintained her correspondence, and continued to be addressed as Empress by everyone who came to see her. She was buried in the Imperial Crypt in Vienna, the Kaisergruft beneath the Kapuzinerkirche, where Habsburg emperors and empresses had been interred since 1633, alongside Franz Joseph and Elizabeth, and 148 other members of the dynasty. She was the last person buried there in the 20th century. The burial required a ceremony that the Republic and the Church had agreed on long before, a formula for receiving a dead Habsburg in a city that had exiled the living ones. The coffin is brought to the door of the crypt. A chamberlain knocks. A voice from inside asks who seeks entry. The chamberlain recites the full titles and dignities of the deceased. The voice says it does not know that person. The chamberlain knocks again and recites the names and offices again. Again, the voice says it does not know that person. On the third knock, the chamberlain says only a name, a mortal and a sinner, who asks for God's mercy. The door opens. The formula dates to the Baroque period and has been used for every imperial burial since. For Zita, in 1989, with a republic outside and the Cold War ending around it, it was carried out exactly as it had been for Maria Theresa and for Franz Joseph. The ritual outlasted the empire by 7 decades. Otto died in 2011 and was buried in the Kaisergruft with the same ceremony. His son Karl, named for his grandfather the last emperor, became the head of the house. Karl von Habsburg, born in 1961, is a former member of the European Parliament who has lived in Austria since the Habsburg Law was repealed in 2011. He does not claim a throne. He leads a foundation dedicated to European unity and the defense of Christian values in politics. He is photographed at charity events and cultural openings. He gives interviews about European identity. He is recognizably a Habsburg in the sense that he is careful, multilingual, and constitutionally incapable of treating himself as a private citizen, but he operates entirely within republican forms and shows no interest in anything that could be described as restoration. His son Ferdinand, born in 1997, is the next generation. He was a student in Vienna when Austria celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Republic in 2018, a centenary that required the country to simultaneously commemorate the end of an empire and the beginning of a democracy, an exercise in historical ambiguity that Austria managed with characteristic awkwardness. Ferdinand attended the commemorations. He was interviewed about his family's legacy. He said the right things about democracy and European unity and the importance of learning from history. He is 26 years old. He has his great-great-grandmother Zita's cheekbones. The physical remnants of the empire are everywhere and nowhere. Schönbrunn is a museum. The Hofburg is partly a museum and partly the official residence of the Austrian president. The Kaisergruft is open to tourists from 9 in the morning until 6 in the evening, and on quiet weekday afternoons you can walk among the copper sarcophagi of the people who governed Central Europe for 600 years and hear nothing but the footsteps of Japanese tour groups and the faint sound of traffic from the Albertinaplatz outside. Franz Joseph's sarcophagus is the largest. Elizabeth's is beside it. Karl's is not there. His body is still in Madeira, where the local authorities have declared the Quinta do Monte a heritage site and where a small museum has been established in the rooms where he died. In Hungary, the question of what the Habsburgs were and what they meant has never been settled cleanly. The Horthy period between the wars was formally a kingdom without a king, a monarchy governed by a regent who refused to let the king return. After the Second World War, the communist government removed the royal regalia from the National Museum and sent them to the United States, where they were held by the State Department until 1978, when Carter returned them to Hungary in a ceremony of remarkable diplomatic strangeness, handing over a crown that had no king to wear it to a republic that had no use for it, amid considerable debate about whether the gesture validated communist legitimacy or undermined it. The crown is now in the Parliament building in Budapest, displayed under continuous armed guard. The Habsburg Law was finally repealed by the Austrian Parliament in 2011, 92 years after it was passed. The repeal had been debated periodically since the 1970s and had failed repeatedly, not because of serious monarchist opposition, but because the law had become a symbol of Republican identity that some members of Parliament were reluctant to remove. When it finally went, the debate was brief and the vote was not close. The House had made its peace with what the dynasty had been by deciding that the expulsion was no longer necessary to define what the Republic was. In Madeira, the church of Nossa Senhora do Monte still holds Karl's tomb. Pilgrims come, not many but a steady stream, people who regard him as blessed in the theological sense and seek his intercession. The Catholic Church has confirmed one miracle attributed to his intercession, a prerequisite for beatification, and the process toward full canonization has proceeded at the Vatican's characteristic pace. Whether the last emperor of Austria becomes a saint remains an open question, to be decided by an institution that operates on timescales that make even the Habsburg Empire look temporary. Zita was 96. Otto was 98. The dynasty that renounced participation in affairs of state on November 11, 1918, produced in its first 2 generations of exile a pair of figures whose combined lifespans stretched from the reign of Franz Joseph to the 21st century, who between them witnessed the collapse of 4 empires, 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the Cold War, and the construction of the European Union in the territory the Habsburgs had once governed, with a 2-part bureaucracy and an emperor who spoke 12 languages and never felt at home in any of them. What the family held on to, after the titles and the palaces and the armies and the property were stripped away, was the particular Habsburg habit of treating whatever room they were in as the room from which everything important would eventually be managed. Karl died of pneumonia in Madeira at 34, having attempted to reclaim his throne twice. Zita ran a court in exile from a convent in Bavaria. Otto served in the European Parliament for 20 years while simultaneously being the symbolic head of a house that had once governed the continent he was now legislating for. None of them were quiet about it. None of them went away. The habit passed to the next generation almost intact. Karl von Habsburg's younger son, Georg, built a career that would have struck his ancestors as an odd inheritance. He worked for years in cultural diplomacy connected to Hungary, the kingdom his family had once ruled by right of birth, and later took on a role tied to the country's Olympic Committee. A Habsburg working at the invitation of the Hungarian state, rather than presiding over it, is the kind of detail that would have seemed impossible to Karl I, as he negotiated with Horthy at gunpoint near Budapest. Georg's many cousins scattered further still, into Belgium, into banking, into ordinary European professional life that has almost nothing to do with sarcophagi or coronation oaths anymore. The family's material wealth shrank to something unremarkable by the standards of European aristocracy. Most of the great Habsburg palaces belong now to the Austrian state, or to museums that charge admission at the door. The family kept a handful of private properties, chief among them a residence near Salzburg, but nothing resembling the crown lands that once stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians. What they kept instead was harder to put a price on. A surname that still opens doors in European diplomacy. A web of royal cousins across Belgium, Luxembourg, and Liechtenstein, most of them tied to the Habsburgs through 19th century marriages that once mattered for treaties and now matter mainly for wedding invitations. And a continuing, mostly ceremonial presence in the public life of a continent that has no empire left for them to inherit. Austria has never staged a referendum on monarchy the way Brazil did in 1993. The subject has barely reached the floor of Parliament since the Habsburg Law's repeal, and polling on it is rare enough to be a curiosity rather than a live political question. What survives instead is a quieter kind of interest, measured in tourism receipts rather than ballots. The Kaisergruft draws hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. Museums devoted to Sisi operate in 3 Austrian cities. The Habsburg image, filtered through film, operetta, and now documentary retellings of the family's private letters, generates more revenue for the modern Austrian state than the family itself ever collected in taxes from its former subjects. Ferdinand, the great-great-grandson born in 1997, has said plainly in interviews that restoration was never a serious question for his generation. He speaks instead about a family that shows up, present at commemorations, occasionally called by journalists writing about the empire's collapse, otherwise indistinguishable from any other well-connected Austrian family with a recognizable name and an old address book. That is a smaller role than emperor of 50 million people, and by every account from people who have met him, Ferdinand does not appear to resent the difference at all. The rituals persist regardless. When a Habsburg dies, the funeral formula at the Kapuzinerkirche remains available, though not every family member chooses it. Karl's heart still lies in the crypt beneath the Augustinian church, separated from his body by an ocean and more than a century, waiting for a reunification that no one has seriously proposed, and that the authorities on Madeira, who now treat his tomb as a heritage asset of their own, would likely resist. Zita's rooms at the convent in Zongburg have reportedly been left much as she kept them. The correspondence between Karl and Zita from the 2 failed attempts on the Hungarian throne survives partly in Austrian archives and partly in private hands, and the historians who have been granted access describe a young couple whose confidence in their own return never fully cracked, not even from a hunting lodge with inadequate heating and a newborn crying in the next room. Compare that to what happened elsewhere on the continent in the same decades. The Romanovs were shot in a cellar in Yekaterinburg. The Ottoman dynasty was expelled from Turkey by law and scattered across 3 continents with far less ceremony than the Habsburgs managed. The Hohenzollerns kept their heads and much of their property, but never regained the moral authority Wilhelm II had squandered by 1918. Against that field, the Habsburgs did something unusual. They lost the empire and kept the family intact, kept the archive, kept the burial rites, kept a documented, continuous line from an emperor who died believing paper might matter again, to a great-great-grandson posing for photographs at a 100th anniversary of the republic that replaced him. What the fall actually cost, in the end, was not the family's survival. It was the particular kind of authority that had let one household govern 11 nationalities across half a continent by treaty, marriage, and inherited habit, rather than by force. That authority does not transfer to a foundation office in Vienna or a seat in the European Parliament, however many decades Otto spent in Strasbourg building something adjacent to it. The empire's actual machinery, the shared army, the joint foreign ministry, the negotiated balance between Vienna and Budapest, ended in the autumn of 1918 and has never been rebuilt in any form, by the Habsburgs or by anyone else. What continues is the family, not the state, and the two were only ever the same thing for as long as an emperor sat in the Hofburg and the nationalities agreed, however grudgingly, to be governed by him. There is also the question of citizenship, which sounds bureaucratic until you notice how much it reveals. For most of the 20th century, being a Habsburg meant being stateless in the most literal sense in the one country that mattered. Otto carried an Austrian passport only from 1966 onward, and even then he continued to build his political career in Germany rather than the country his family had ruled for 600 years. His children were born Austrian citizens without controversy, a fact that would have seemed unthinkable to the parliament that passed the Habsburg Law in 1919, and unthinkable too to Karl himself, who spent his last years lobbying foreign governments for the right to simply live in the country he had governed. The normalization happened so gradually that no single date marks it. There was no ceremony announcing that the Habsburgs had finally become ordinary Austrians. It just happened, across decades, through passports issued and school enrollments completed and tax returns filed like anyone else's, until a family that had once required a special law to keep out of the country needed no law at all to stay in it. The Hungarian side of the family's history took a stranger turn, because the crown of St. Stephen sat empty from 1918 until the monarchy was formally abolished in 1946. Hungary spent nearly 3 decades as a kingdom in name only, ruled by a regent who had once served as a Habsburg admiral and who ultimately blocked the family he was nominally guarding the throne for. Horthy's own fall at the hands of Nazi Germany in 1944 and then the advancing Soviet army in 1945 ended any remaining possibility of a Habsburg restoration in Budapest more thoroughly than his refusal to let Karl land in 1921 ever could. By the time communism took hold in Hungary, the question of whether a Habsburg might someday wear St. Stephen's crown had become not just unlikely but almost meaningless. A debate about a throne inside a country that no longer had thrones as a category of political thought. Georg's later work with Hungarian cultural and Olympic institutions exists in the shadow of that history, a family relationship to a country rebuilt entirely on terms the family had no part in setting. Karl died at 34 in a rented villa on an island he had never wanted to see. He believed, by every account that survives from Madeira, that the paper he had signed in the Yellow Salon still left a door open somewhere. It did not in the way he meant it. But his descendants kept walking through a different door instead, the one at the Kapuzinerkirche, 3 knocks and 3 refusals, and a name spoken plainly before it opens. They have been doing that since 1633. They are still doing it now, in a republic that no longer needs them and has never quite managed to stop watching them anyway. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.